Well, it's been one rainy week here, and we really needed it. It's been raining off and on all week. Heavy rain, light rain. But anyway, I thank the good Lord for it. We need it real bad. Well, anyway, while I'm rained out, I thought I'd share one of my little unexplained stories. It's got to do with metal detecting. So I hope you enjoy it. Now, this little story took place in a national park. Now, we all know you don't metal detect in a national park, let alone a Civil War battlefield. And it took place in Stones River National Battlefield, just outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, southeast of Nashville. This happened back in the 60s. Now, this old battlefield has seen a lot of carnage. It was a big battle. It was between Bragg and Rosecrans, Stones River battlefield, with 23,000 casualties. It's such a beautiful place, like all the other battlefields nowadays. But after dark, things change a lot in these old battlefields. Well, anyway, the story goes that there was a guy had been digging around these battlefields at night. He'd been finding old Civil War treasures like this, buttons, relics, belt buckles, and he'd been selling them to collectors and pawn shops what he could get away with. And they'd been watching him a long time and trying to catch him. But they never could prove nothing. They never could catch him in the act. But they kept trying. This went on for a year or two, the story goes, back in the 60s. And he would hide out during the day, his truck, off the road in these woods. And when it got dark, he'd come out and he'd go to these old battlefields. And he'd start getting around the cut places and all where he knowed where the battle took place, where he'd been finding stuff before. And he pulled his truck around to another place here and been hunting it, and they just happened to notice his truck sitting there when they was making their patrols. And well, that's him. We're going to catch him. They went out in the field there. They didn't see him right off, but they seen his metal detector and his shovel and his tools laying there where he'd been digging, but they didn't see him, so they looked around. Well, they finally found him a little ways off, sitting on a rock, holding his head, mumbling. They couldn't get him to come to his senses, like he'd lost his mind. He couldn't talk, wouldn't say nothing. He was in a state of shock, bad shock. And they just couldn't do nothing with him, so they called an ambulance and got him to come and get him. And still, he just babbling in a state of bad shock. So they took him on to the hospital. And he stayed there for a few days till he come to his senses, and he finally told what happened. Said he'd been digging, he'd found some old relics of just before this happened to him. He'd found some old buttons, some old belt buckles. He found an old buckle, and just as he found another old button, he said a hand reached up out of the ground all of a sudden and grabbed the buttons out of his hand and went back down in the ground. Well, then he just lost his mind. I just lost it. And he just went into a state of shock. And they say, the story goes, that no matter from there on, he just couldn't get it out of his head. Anywhere he closed his eyes or thought, all he would see was just hands coming out of the ground, wanting back what he'd dug up in this battlefield. And they say, the story goes, that he lost his mind and they had to put him away. So that was the story that I was told. Maybe you've heard the same story. But I know that would put anybody in a state of shock. So this is just an old story of metal detecting, unexplained, strange. So I hope you enjoyed this little old story. I like sharing these little stories with you. So I want to thank you for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next time.